Folks, this is Book Talk with Corbin. I'm your host. It is a great privilege and blessing. We have Mr. Richard Ennis as a returning guest, Secretary of it. Well, I told him before the interview I was not going to refer to him as the Secretary of Education, and what's the first thing flying out of my mouth? He's an education analyst at the Bluegrass Institute. And brother, before we end the interview, I'd like you just to touch upon a little bit what is the Bluegrass Institute. But before we do that, let's do a quick review, summation of what we discussed the last time. I think you had said to us that Kentucky is not doing a good job in preparing our young people for furthering their education beyond grade 12, and that we really haven't made much progress in the past 30 years. Is that correct?
That sadly is very correct. So whether we look at results from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is a federal testing program that is ongoing from 1992, depending on the subject and grade level, up to the present, or we look at the ACT college entrance test results, astonishingly low numbers of our children are being adequately prepared for what they need to know to succeed in life. Reading is the most disturbing example of all. For African American Kentucky students, the most recent National Assessment of Educational Progress from 2019, which is pre-COVID, showed only 14% of the state's Black students were adequately prepared and were reading at a proficient level. Just 14%.
Wow.
It's just depressing. And numbers we get from the ACT aren't that much different. The two testing systems tend to agree. Even for our white students who have made a little progress in reading, the amount of progress they've made is totally inadequate compared to where we need to have them. And as of 2019, only 39% of our white students were adequately prepared in reading. And even worse, that is down from where it was a couple of earlier test cycles back in 2015. We're actually losing ground. We're not moving forward anymore. We're going backwards, and that's pre-COVID. So the bottom line is our education system, over the 30 years of very expensive reform efforts that came after the Kentucky Education Reform Act of 1990 was passed, has not produced anything close to what we really need. So that's the reality.
How does that impact, I don't know how to put this, college enrollment and college graduation rates?
It has a big impact on college, obviously. If a student cannot read well enough to survive, even in the non-technical college courses, they're not going to survive in college, and it impacts the graduation rates from college. Obviously, a lot of students won't even apply to college because they realize from their past performance that they're not going to succeed. But even among those that do, I think only about half are successfully graduating after 6 years, not 4 years, but 6 years in the college environment. That's pretty bad. And considering about roughly half of our kids are going on to college, it's a little more than that. But putting all that together, only about a quarter of the kids that start out in K to 12 are making it through to a college degree right now. That's something our economy is not going to survive with well. But even worse, getting back to reading, the ACT, the people who do the college entrance test, have done a lot of other research. They actually work with business and industry and have created tests for them to make sure that people coming into non-college track jobs have enough education to make it through their apprenticeship programs, for example. And ACT is now saying that, based on some research they did in 2015, that living wage, non-college track jobs now require pretty much the same kind of basic skills in math and reading that a freshman in college needs. So the ACT test is no longer telling us, well, these kids aren't very well prepared for college. They're telling us these kids aren't really very well prepared to survive in life.
Wow.
It's a serious situation. We're setting a lot of our kids up. We did some research at the Bluegrass Institute. We put a report out over the summer about what Milton Wright knew about reading that a lot of our teachers apparently don't. And in there, we worked an estimate from the test results from the NAEP, as we call the federal test program, and ACT. We estimated, and it's a pretty good estimate, I'm told, that 200,000 of our students in the K to 12 enrollment in our public schools, 200,000 are reading at a level that the federal test would describe as not even partial mastery of reading, not even partial. To me, that means they're basically non-readers. Right. That's not going to be a good condition for them when they graduate from high school. And tens of thousands each year are coming out in that category based on ACT results that we're getting. It's a super, super serious problem. Right. It has massive implications for the future of our economy. We have got to fix this.
Now, I'm not trying to get too political here, but, of late, I get a lot. I do several interviews on critical race theory, and I get a lot of response to that. A lot of my listeners really jump on that. Help me connect the dots here. I hear a lot of educators here in Louisville. They really, really want that critical race theory curriculum, whatever, in the school system. A lot of Board of Education members, they want that. Is there any way that critical race theory can help boost these reading skills, these reading proficiency tests?
Well, one of the problems we have when people are talking about critical race theory, everybody thinks it means something different. It's not well defined as it is being popularly used today. What most members of the public actually think critical race theory is now is inappropriate teaching practices. Now, inappropriate teaching practices doesn't necessarily mean teaching an accurate factual history of what happened in this country, which includes teaching about slavery and its implications and the things that happened after the Civil War was fought. Mm-hmm. That is not inappropriate, but that's not what bothers people. What bothers people is taking kids in elementary school, dividing them up into two groups by race, and telling the group of white kids, well, you're the oppressors, and telling the kids of color, well, you're the people who've been oppressed and bullied and treated badly, and winding up really not giving these kids useful and positive information, but making them feel like they're either evil or they're oppressed, and the oppressed ones feel like, well, gee, there's no hope for us. We've always been put down, it'll never change. And the white kids come home crying to mom, I'm an evil person. That's not positive. Right. And the problem is there are classrooms where that's happening. I'm not saying it happens in every classroom. Right now, what goes on in classrooms across the country is very uncontrolled. And it's more uncontrolled here in Kentucky than maybe anywhere else, especially in this area, which gets into the area of social studies. Now, we do have a printed document in the state of Kentucky put out by the Kentucky Department of Education and approved by the legislature through the regulatory approval process called the Kentucky Academics for Social Studies. And I've spent quite a bit of time on this, and it touches on a whole bunch of things that are important and relate, I think, to this discussion we're having now about this inappropriate teaching issue. And let's talk a little bit about social studies standards in Kentucky.
Yes.
They are horrible. They are vacuous and incomplete, which opens up the door, unfortunately, for people to come in talking about, we're going to teach something we are calling critical race theory, but whatever they're teaching may not be the right stuff because the social studies document doesn't give them enough guidance about what the right stuff really is. Let me give you an example. We'll start right at the top. Now, the National Council for the social studies says that there's actually about 13 different strands or disciplines that should be included in a good, solid social studies program. And those include civics, geography, economics, history, anthropology, archaeology, the law, philosophy, political science, psychology, religion, sociology, and the humanities. All that's in social studies. Otherwise, it's not covered in our curriculum at all because it's not covered in science, not covered in math, not covered in reading. Mm-hmm. But at the beginning of the Kentucky Social Studies document, it says they're only going to cover 4 strands, not 13, just 4. The only ones they mention are civics, geography, economics, and history. Things like the law and religion and sociology, not mentioned at all. So does that mean our kids are only going to get 4/13 of the education the kids in other states are going to get on social studies? Maybe so. Now, when you dig into the document, it gets a lot worse. I think most of your listeners are well enough informed to know that one of the most important presidents who ever served our nation, Abraham Lincoln, was born here in Kentucky.
Yes.
We even have a national park at the birthplace of Abraham Lincoln. I visited it. There's a model log cabin similar to the one he was actually born in. It's not the actual one, but it's in there inside a shrine building for this most important president that we ever maybe had in the country, certainly one of the most. Don't you think Abraham Lincoln should be mentioned as a subject for specific discussion in Kentucky social studies standards?
Absolutely. Yes.
I defy you to find his name. I've looked through it using, the search feature in Adobe Acrobat. It's a Adobe Acrobat PDF document. Abraham Lincoln is not in this document anywhere. Never mentioned. In fact, only 5 historical personalities from all time are mentioned in the document. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson are mentioned. Sam Adams is mentioned, the revolutionary leader, but not President John Adams or his son John Quincy Adams. Only Sam Adams. I guess the teachers knew about the beer. But right. The only 2 others are Henry Clay and Daniel Boone. That's it. None of the other presidents, including some pretty significant ones that have had big impact on what's happened in this country, none of them are mentioned. Not one. Mm-hmm. And you will be told by teachers, oh, yeah, but we're going to talk about Lincoln because we have to talk about the Civil War. And the Civil War is briefly mentioned in the document, although a whole lot of detail about what's going to be covered in the Civil War is also notoriously absent. So coverage is going to vary on that widely from school to school and even classroom to classroom, because there's not enough guidance in this document to make sure that our kids will get a common core that is consistent across the state. That doesn't mean teachers shouldn't have the ability to put some individual stuff about things they're personally interested in, but there should be a common core that's fairly detailed information that all of our kids get. And it's not in this document. It's not there. It's not going to happen. There's just so much missing. It's amazing. But since Lincoln is not specifically mentioned, if you only cover Lincoln during the Civil War years, what happens to the important American exceptionalism story about how our country allowed a backwoodsman with no education when he started to basically largely self-educate, rise to become a lawyer and a very skilled politician, and eventually lead our country in one of its most challenging times in its entire history.
Yes.
With success. That's an American exceptionalism story. And because his name's not mentioned, and because much of his story, his personal story, obviously came before the Civil War even started, and technically his death came after the Civil War had ended.
Yes.
A great deal of his story isn't going to be told in every classroom. At least it doesn't have to be. It might be, or it might not be. How can you tell? This document doesn't ensure that happens. It's